and thanks for listening to the Explaining History podcast. And today I want to talk about Japan in 1941. Specifically, what happens in Japan following the news that Pearl Harbor has been attacked, and the general mentality of ordinary Japanese people at that period of time. That mentality is shaped by the events of the previous 2 years. The book I've mainly been reading on this subject at the moment is Japan 1941 by Eri Hotta, which is, for my mind, one of the best comprehensive studies of Japan's decision-making, or the decision-making of Japan's leaders at this time, and also the relationship between Japan's leadership and the wider population. Also, if you stay tuned at the end of the podcast, you can receive your 10% discount for Audio Pie podcasts, which are ideal for armchair listeners, students, teachers, and everyone in between. Okay, so let's make a start. The first thing that the Japanese people hear on the morning of December the 8th, 1941, to their great surprise, is that Japan had entered a situation of war with the United States and Britain in the Western Pacific. The announcement doesn't go into specifics, but the following pieces of information become commonly known. Pearl Harbor is the target. Planes have attacked at 1:30 a.m. Japanese time, and by 5:30 a.m., 4 hours later, the operation was completed. Japan declares war on Britain and the United States, and 2 hours before Pearl Harbor had been attacked, Malaya and Hong Kong had also been attacked, and the Malayan campaign was going, by that point, extremely well. The Japanese population is glued to its wirelesses, as you can imagine, and further details come in hour by hour. Much of this is a complete and utter surprise to most Japanese people, but very little of it is unwelcome. Why? Because of the economic conditions that Japan has existed in for the previous 2 years. Japan had not ended diplomatic relations when the Pearl Harbor attack happened, and hadn't declared war either. So it was a surprise attack in every sense of the word, an enormous gamble. It relied on taking out the US Pacific Fleet carriers while the attack was on. This doesn't happen. The 4 carriers are out at sea, and it's only battleships and other support vessels that are sunk, specifically, most infamously, the USS Arizona. And the Great Gambit is essentially a costly failure. It means that the US fleet's most powerful ships, its carriers, can continue to wage war in the Pacific, and by the following year would have scored 2 significant victories over Japan at Coral Sea and Midway, with a series of other battles being fought around Guadalcanal. In total, by the end of the summer of 1942, Japan's Navy and Naval Air Force have been devastated by the United States in a series of 4 major set-piece battles. Japanese Air Force unable to replenish itself because of the restrictions that were placed on the numbers of Japanese aviators. Japanese aviators rather like to see themselves as something of a samurai class, exclusive and limited in their number, whereas the American practices of mass production meant that pilots were mass trained, aircrafts were mass built, and the ability of the United States to continue to replenish itself, which has always been America's the real essence of American power in the world, steamrolls Japan in the coming years. Anyway, that is but an aside. Since 1937, Japan's war in China had consumed not just the Kwangtung Army and the other forces that Japan sent to support it, but also Japanese society itself. Japanese society had become more state regulated, more authoritarian. The privations that Japanese people went through in order to sacrifice for the army's successes increased. State control over the economy grew, and Japanese people would have been forgiven for drawing easy parallels between Japan's war in China and Napoleon's wars in Russia. The expanse of China is so great, and the ability of nationalist armies to withdraw and to draw Japan ever further into this exhausting quagmire are immense. So Japan becomes enormously reliant on imports of fuel and scrap metal. The Japanese islands themselves are devoid really of the kinds of raw materials that are ideal for waging war. The growing Japanese population that has boomed since the 19th century also requires imports of food to sustain it. One of the arguments about the necessity of Japanese imperialism in China and Asia was that Japan, this growing martial nation, seen in similar terms to which Hitler viewed Germany, a vital, strong, and growing people, needed to colonize resources from their nearer neighbours. There's a great deal of confusing ideas in Japan towards China. There are some overtly fascistic ideas about viewing the Chinese as a kind of an Untermensch, and these definitely prevail when Japan seizes large parts of China. But there were also these Pan-Asian ideas that China was simply the elder brother that had fallen behind, and that it had not fully grasped the tricks that Westerners had employed in a way that Japan in the second half of the 19th century certainly had done. Japan is able to prove this at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905 by destroying the Russian fleet and igniting Asia in a anti-European, Pan-Asian emancipatory spirit, with Japan being the kind of the focus of all their many of Asian nationalists' hopes and ambitions. And there were many Japanese Pan-Asianists that thought, well, if only we could be the example to China, through some kind of colonization, we can bring China up to date and discipline and instruct China, then Asia would be the rising power and would pivot around Japan. So there were some, what you might call, relatively idealistic notions of Japanese imperialism, but these notions by the early 1940s are in the decline. And the way in which Japan actually treats conquered countries suggests that fascistic racial ideas about Japanese superiority prevail. If you imagine that when we look at the very well publicised stories of British or Allied or American or Australian prisoners of war on the Burma Railway, or in the American case in Bataan, those casualties, those deaths, make up 1% of all of the prisoner deaths caused by Japan. So that means that the other 99% of prisoners who died building railways, in forced brothels, in slave labour camps, and other Japanese war industry enterprises were Burmese, Malay, Indian, and predominantly Chinese. So it really brings home the way in which Japan actually treated Asia. Far from liberating it, Japan enslaves it in a way that Europeans could only really have dreamt of. By 1940, there were serious questions amongst the Japanese population about the war in China. The Japanese population had been bombarded with jingoistic and entirely over-optimistic news stories implying that success was round the corner. But it's really very difficult to convince the population at any point to sustain a long drawn-out war, and certainly to continue convincing them that success is near. Populations are almost mentally and emotionally predisposed towards short victorious wars which risk next to nothing and present glory and bounty in spadefuls. And Japan's war in China is not going to be such an experience. The problem that Japan faces, and the problem for Japanese living standards, is that America, keen on its own open door policy in China, meaning that America wanted unfettered trade in China and in Asia in general, is very suspicious of Japan and condemnatory of Japanese intentions in China, and also deeply angered by the sinking of a patrol boat, the USS Panay, in 1937 at Nanjing, following the seizure of the city by Japan. A British warship, the HMS B, was also sunk at the same time, and this really signified an end to European and American control of Chinese river systems, particularly the Yangtze, which had been pioneered since the 1860s. I'm sure I've done a podcast. You might want to look back on European colonization of China using railway and steamships some time ago, probably sometime last summer. I think I wrote it. Recorded it, sorry. Anyway, America's relationship with Japan becomes ever frostier when the Japanese seize French Indochina. They firstly come to an arrangement with the fascist puppet Vichy government that was installed in France following the fall of France to Germany in the summer of 1940. And then in 1941, the remaining parts of Indochina that haven't already been garrisoned by Japanese troops are seized. And it's at this point that Franklin Roosevelt imposes embargoes on Japan. And this is crippling to the economy. The Japanese Admiral Nomura Kichisaburo was sent to Washington to see if some kind of peaceful solution to Japanese isolation could be negotiated. But there was nothing forthcoming from the White House. The fact that Japan had chosen to ally with Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, then also to seize Indochina, gave a clear message of intent to Roosevelt's administration. The effects on Japanese everyday life are immense. Not just the effects of the embargo, but the effects of the war in general. The ability of Japan to provide luxury items to its population becomes all but impossible by early 1941. But also the pressure of the war on the Japanese food economy also becomes unsustainable, rice, the main staple of the Japanese diet, becomes rare. Why? Because young men who would normally have been farming are sent to fight, and the ability to recoup these losses by plundering foods from China is much more difficult than previously thought. Not only do the Kuomintang nationalists fight a scorched earth policy, but occupying and cultivating and using Chinese manpower to create enough food to export back to China, back to Japan, is extremely problematic. Tokyo restaurants have to start serving cheap imported rice. Japanese culture and culinary culture surrounding rice is extremely sophisticated. And cheaper imported rice was seen as a real decline in Japanese living standards. The rice that was eaten by Japanese people was normally of extremely high quality. And by April, even the low quality rice is being rationed. And then by December of 1941, 99% of the entire population is eating from ration books. And so you go from a country where domestic rice has a kind of an exalted place in the national diet. This is seen as an absolute national scandal. Moreover, life in prosperous Tokyo and other cities seemed to have become greyer, drabber, and more full of privation and hardship. And in Eri Hotta's book, she quotes Nagai Kafu, who was, it seems like the kind of Walter Benjamin of Japanese life, a bohemian intellectual, who writes in his diary, "The townscape of central Tokyo belies its prosperity of only half a year ago. There are no activities, and it is all quiet. Around 6 p.m. it fills with crowds of commuters, just as before. But the clothes that these men and women are wearing, to say they have become subdued is an understatement. They have become old mannish and dowdy. Women do not seem to care what they look like anymore, not bothering to put on any makeup. The street does not get lit at night, so people hurry home. Those people who squeeze themselves into trains, shoving one another, look like refugees." So the drabness of Japanese life was an indicator for this dynamic and previously prosperous country that an almost irreconcilable social catastrophe was unfolding, a social crisis. And the government are happy to promote this spirit of austerity, of shared national sacrifice in the pursuit of a national cause, i.e. the conquest of China. And the militaristic government had an idea that really it was better to turn all of Japan into one large barracks with barrack-style conditions, and for the population to experience privation for the long struggle ahead, than for the wealthy and the pampered to indulge themselves and to become weak and thus weaken overall the national martial spirit. And again, there are interesting parallels with the views of Nazis here in the rights and roles of the individuals and the rights of individuals to enjoy individual pursuits, which they believed there weren't any such rights. The government place posters such as "Luxury is the enemy" and "True Japanese cannot afford to be indulgent," thus associating the notion of Japaneseness and membership of the national community with privation and struggle. And it goes without saying, of course, that not all Japanese would have thought of themselves in such terms. However, you have the development of patriotic associations. These had been in existence for much of the interwar years, but they come out onto the streets in force in 1940 and 1941, criticising and admonishing women who wore makeup and dressed in nice clothes, who were sort of evidence of corrupt and individualistic Western lifestyles. And the Western element of things is part of the picture here. The fact that Westernness is being criticised and attacked is only part of the story. It's not simply that the Japanese government and Japanese nationalists wish to see themselves as binary opposites to the West. In fact, they were constantly emulating Western industrial, economic, military, and bureaucratic processes anyway, and this is why Western culture found a more than a safe place to exist within Japan. It is expedient when faced with dispute with European powers over China to criticise evidence of Europeanness manifesting itself in Japanese culture. But the need for Japanese people to think collectively, Japanese people to experience hardship collectively, is much more important in the eyes of the government, and that's what these campaigns are really about, getting people ready for long periods of sacrifice, when the reality is that modern consumer societies, when they develop, are completely resistant to these sorts of notions. Places like department stores and other sites of conspicuous consumption also become highly suspect. And in October 1940, October the 31st, 1940 in fact, dance halls and jazz music were declared to be illegal. So, the explosion of euphoria that happens across the nation after the Pearl Harbor attack has less to do with a nation obsessed with warfare, virulently hating anything European or American and delighted at the outbreak of conflict, and more to do with a country that has seen its fortunes since the war in China began decline on a national and also on an individual scale. This is a country that has experienced several decades of Western-style modernity, rising living standards and rising prosperity, and very much enjoyed it. And seeing these things begin to slip away because of the military's Napoleonic quests in China that are going badly wrong, and the war, the outbreak of war against America is seen as the last way of fighting out of the impasse, of cutting through the Gordian knot, to make sure that Japan's fortunes are at some point restored, and many Japanese see it as the noose around Japan's neck being cut. This is all partly based on lack of information. Had many Japanese been aware that the raid on Pearl Harbor had been a strategic failure, as the four carriers still existed, and that now the full fury of the United States would be thrown against Japan, there would have been far less cause for euphoria. But I think it's important sometimes to look at history when we're looking at these pivotal moments from a social perspective. So instead of simply seeing what Japan's generals were thinking, or Japan's prime minister, or Japan's emperor, or what Roosevelt or Marshall or anyone else was thinking, what actually is guiding the vast majority of ordinary people Japanese and American, to dictate the terms of it in the course of events. Okay, so as loyal listeners will know, you've got a 10% discount waiting for you at AudioPie, creators of study podcasts for students, teachers, and armchair historians. And without further ado, here is their exciting advert.
The mist of a November dawn doesn't shroud the smell of mud, dried sweat, or the latrine. Yet there's something different in the air. Silence. The guns have stopped. So's the shouting. What next? Welcome to AudioPie's GCSE series on Germany between 1919 and 1945. During this series,
to find out more, go to www.audiopie.co.uk and quote the promo code EXPLAIN when you get to the checkout. AudioPie, inspiring education.